Artem Branzhukov, political scientist and international affairs expert, is now joining us live. Hello, Artyom.
Good morning.
Artyom, let's try to figure this out. Is it really the case? Is the Russian Federation really losing influence, generally speaking, not just in the Middle East, but across the so called global south, broadly speaking? And does this really concern Russia? After all, strikes on Iran also mean rising oil prices. And economically, the Russian Federation depends on profits from oil. So perhaps that's why Russia isn't in a hurry to help Iran, not to mention the fact that it simply lacks the resources. How do you assess, in reality, whether the Russian Federation is concerned about what is happening in the Middle East?
100%. In principle, what is happening in the Middle East once again shows and emphasizes that it's not just like that. American President Donald Trump called Putin a paper tiger because, in principle, it's an adventure. In the context of the war that Putin unleashed against Ukraine, it was supposed to emphasize his international geopolitical status, to demonstrate that Russia, in principle, has the ability to impose its will on the territory of other states. But having become bogged down in the war in Ukraine and having spent, in principle, all the resources that were accumulated not only during his rule, but also those that had been amassed earlier, even back in the Soviet Union era, Putin essentially found himself in a situation where he bet everything on zero and lost. That's why we saw the very rapid collapse of Bashar al-Assad's regime in Syria and after that, Venezuela. Now, the Russians are simply observing the US and Israeli operation against Iran and are in no position to help in any way. If we look back into the past, over the centuries, repeatedly, for example, when Israel was waging wars against various Middle Eastern and Arab states, the Soviet Union constantly provided a huge amount of military and technical assistance. Now, Putin is in such a weak position that he can't even send additional air defense systems, which probably could have helped Iran repel all these air attacks. He simply has no way to do so. Basically, yes, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has put an end to his status as a major geopolitical player. And this point applies not only to countries where the US has carried out various operations, some more successful, some still ongoing. But if we look at the South Caucasus, both Azerbaijan and Armenia are currently conducting their foreign policy based on one calculation: to distance themselves from Russia as much as possible. And on the one hand, Azerbaijan is focusing its attention on Turkey, while Armenia is trying to get closer to France and the European Union. Central Asia has also been lost by Putin. At present, China is very actively expanding its influence there, and Trump is not forgetting and is not giving up attempts to establish connections with Kazakhstan, with Turkmenistan, and with Uzbekistan as well. Therefore, overall, at the present moment, when analyzing the situation, it is necessary to understand that the only thing keeping Putin in the current global news agenda is his aggressive war against Ukraine. And on the one hand, the limitations of the Kremlin dictator's resources are perceived, and quite logically so, as positive developments. But at the same time, precisely because of the lack of influence in other parts of the world, Putin will cling with all his might to continuing the war against Ukraine. This is his only opportunity to remain on the current agenda. In
The Freedom app live broadcasts special projects, reports from around the world, and up to date analysis. All the most important things right on your smartphone. Simple, fast, convenient, and free. Download the Freedom app from the App Store or Play Market. One click and you're at the center of events. Know everything. With Freedom, it's easy. The US and Israeli operation in Iran could serve as a good signal for the Russian dictator Putin. Of course, that's meant in quotation marks. After all, it's a reminder of how dictators actually end up. President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky stated this in a comment to journalists. Let's listen.
Russia has already shown itself as an ally during the events in Syria when Putin was unable to save Assad's regime. Now the situation is repeating itself. Also, in my opinion, they have once again demonstrated their weakness. In other words, as allies, they are insignificant. Moscow cannot help anyone because all of Russia's armed forces are concentrated in Ukraine. They have no more forces left. And what is happening in Iran, it seems to me, is a good signal for Putin to see how a dictatorship ends. Volodymyr Zelensky, president of Ukraine, during a conversation with journalists.
How do you assess how exactly does the Kremlin perceive this signal against the Iranian dictatorship? Considering that not so long ago, let's recall Trump having taken information from the Kremlin and Putin as reality. Putin complained that supposedly Ukrainian drones attacked one of his residences. And how could this happen to the leader of a country? And so on. In principle, this was perceived very negatively. Let's put it that way. Such a scenario from Ukraine's side, which in reality did not happen. Nevertheless, we remember Trump's reaction to this. And I'm interested in this question in a different context. If the US and Israel do achieve their goals, will this shake things up overall? The axis of evil, which, let me remind viewers, is now in the 21st century considered to be the alliance of Russia, China, Iran, and North Korea. And what is Russia without this axis of evil, without these countries? So these are the three aspects.
Overall, if we talk about Putin's reaction, I think the bald spot on his head will become much bigger than it was before, and the number of briefcases his assistants carry for him will increase exponentially. Putin, in principle, and not just Putin, there has always been an unspoken rule regarding any dictator. Before he is overthrown, hanged, or killed, or put in prison, he must first lose a war. As for, say, Khamenei, the US, together with Israel, used a revolutionary new approach. They first decapitated the leadership of a 90 million strong country, and now they are carrying out localized operations. We'll see, though, whether they succeed, because Iran is not Venezuela, and achieving the goal of overthrowing the regime will be much more difficult, but that's not our topic right now. As for Putin and his lost influence, I don't think that at this point anyone would be ready to carry out an operation similar to the one conducted in Iran, because Russia, unlike Iran, unfortunately possesses nuclear weapons. And we've always seen that this has been a deterrent factor. And for Biden, as well as for the Europeans who tried to help Putin save face and establish some kind of relations, this approach was also more characteristic. For President Trump, it's precisely because they want to have, even if it's a madman, at least a controllable dictator, and the potential collapse of Russia in the event of Putin's removal threatens that various criminal groups, let's say the Kadyrov clan and other local strongmen in Russia, could gain control of nuclear weapons, and then it would be much more difficult to manage all these processes. Third, regarding the axis of evil, it has indeed been seriously weakened. And in this context, it's very interesting to observe the lack of reaction from China. Well, or rather, there is a reaction, but it's quite toothless and feeble, which once again highlights their unpreparedness. At the moment, China is not fully ready to compete and flex its geopolitical muscles in the face of such an aggressive policy from Washington. For Russia, in principle, the loss of territory and the loss of influence over such a large number of territories essentially marks the end of this inept cycle of Putin's rule, which has already lasted more than 20 years. And Putin, as a dictator, of course, would like to draw a certain line under it all, to demonstrate his significance to the Russian state as a great gatherer of lands. But in reality, Putin turned out to be one of the biggest adventurists in Russian history, who in many ways buried all the efforts that the Russian emperors and the Soviet Union invested in expanding this empire.
You already mentioned Ali Khamenei. So his death opens up the possibility for long-awaited changes in the Middle East. This was stated by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Finland. The head of the Foreign Policy Department, Elina Valtonen, wrote on the social network X that Iran's dictatorship has long been shackles for its own citizens, as well as an obstacle to peace throughout the region. Let's listen.
The Iranian people deserve the right to freedom. There must be an orderly path for citizens to regain control over their lives and their country, control that has been denied to them for far too long. The risk of a spiral of violence in the Middle East remains a problem. We need diplomacy and good faith negotiations. The civilian population must be protected at all times. Elina Valtonen, Minister of Foreign Affairs of Finland, on the social network X.
As well. President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen stated that the Iranian people have gained new hope for the possibility of determining their own future. Do you really see yourself agreeing with her and other European leaders in this context? Do such sentiments really have the potential to prevail in Iran? And as you see it, until what point will the Russian Federation, so to speak, simply observe this regime's downfall? And is it possible that at some point it might actually dare to offer, so to speak, some kind of assistance? And if so, what kind? And is it really possible that China could also respond when it sees that one of its largest proxies, yes, Iran is essentially considered as such by international analysts and military experts, might also take such a step?
Allow me to somewhat disagree with you because it's rather difficult to call Iran a proxy. It is a strategic junior partner of China, but clearly not a proxy, considering that, in principle, Iran has always created its own agenda, established its own political connections, and itself controls a large number of proxies. Therefore, from a political science perspective, this issue is quite debatable. As for whether the Russian Federation can somehow help Iran, which, based on given the objective factors we are observing today, apart from making cautious statements and condemning strikes against the political leadership, while not naming the actors or those behind these strikes, this basically tells us that Putin is not ready to somehow help the Iranian regime. And third, regarding the possibilities for regime change, at the present moment, it's also hard for me to agree with both Sibiga and our European allies because as long as this fog of war hasn't cleared, it will be quite difficult to characterize the situation. Because the Europeans and Americans, let's be honest, missed the best moment for these attacks about a month ago, maybe a bit more, right after New Year's, when there were active protests in Iran. Back in those days, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is the powerful local security bloc and the primary force that works to uphold the regime, brutally destroyed approximately 10,000 protesters. This tragic event remains a dark chapter in history. And at the present moment, as we can see, it's quite difficult for this passionate segment of society to organize because even in the wake of the recent strikes, the power in Iran, though largely decentralized, still remains. But it is still strong enough to suppress civil protests. Therefore, at this point, I would say that without a ground operation by the Allies, regime change is less likely than a civil revolution and the rise to power of new figures who would represent radically opposing political ideas in Iran. We all remember that the United States, in reserve, there is Reza Pahlavi, a prince who could potentially become the new leader. But his support among the actual population in Iran is rather unclear at this point, considering that he has in fact never even been to Iran in his entire life. And for any more far-reaching conclusions and assessments, we still need to wait and see how the American-Israeli operation ends, especially considering what both Trump and Marco Rubio emphasized yesterday is that the first wave of strikes is over, but it is clearly not going to be the last. And the main strike by the US is being prepared in the near future.
Well, as you see it, is there really, as Sibigo said, a domino effect among dictatorial regimes happening right now? Assessing the internal situation within the Russian Federation itself, do these external events in the Middle East and the elimination of Khamenei influence the internal mood in the Russian Federation, including among the elite? Because after all, something like this could really happen to Putin as well. And what would happen to them then? Or maybe somewhere something could, well, turn out, as they say, ahead of the situation. What do you think? Do external events influence internal politics within the Kremlin?
They do. Basically, it's no secret to anyone that the Russian elites, the Russian oligarchs, have long been against the war. They don't like the sanctions, they don't like the economic stagnation that the Russian state is in. But at the same time, it should be understood that basically the Russian power structure is very much tailored to Putin himself, and even his closest circle serves more as attendants than as any kind of strategic advisors. Basically, personally, I have serious doubts about Putin's ability to perceive reality adequately. Therefore, it seems to me that in particular his understanding that Putin is cornered may actually complicate the negotiation process to some extent because Putin realizes that he has neither influence nor allies. And at this point, his war against Ukraine is simply the final opportunity to preserve at least some kind of status for himself on the international stage. Regarding the domino effect and the fall of regimes, this is also quite debatable because regimes are generally destroyed by brute force. And as we can see, at the moment, the West is not considering such a strategy towards Russia. The physical elimination of Putin, of course, would be a wonderful gift to the entire civilized world. But again, here we return to the nuclear threat, which is always the main factor preventing any aggressive actions against the Russian Federation. But at the same time, this really shows that Putin's resources are not running out and a competent sanctions policy, plus providing Ukraine with additional types of weapons that could be used to destroy targets, Russian military factories, and selectively taking out infrastructure. The energy infrastructure, all of this would really bring us closer to a situation in which Putin would be forced to sit down at the negotiating table. And within the framework of these negotiations, to discuss real points of a plan that could ultimately be called a just peace and a security structure that will last for many years to come, and in principle bring peace both to Ukraine and to the entire continent.
I wanted to bring the topic closer to Ukraine, and of course, I would also like to believe, and we will hope, that external defeats will eventually begin to destabilize, so to speak, the power vertical in Moscow. So, regarding Ukraine, in your opinion, will the loss of external levers of influence in the Middle East change, or perhaps not, the Russian Federation's negotiating position on Ukraine? At the possible upcoming trilateral summit between the US, Ukraine, and Russia, which is expected soon, though the place and time are still unknown. I
Think that this is indeed a serious psychological blow to Putin's position and in general to his ambitions. He obviously understands the situation he has found himself in. No one consulted with him, he wasn't warned, and he himself was unable to proactively respond to these events. It seems to me it's worth noting that after the US took Maduro, Putin didn't comment on the situation even once, nor did he appear in public. And we all know how much he likes to express his point of view regarding such major global events, which once again demonstrates in principle Putin's unwillingness to stand up to Trump and Russia's current inability to respond to those global challenges that exist for their regime and for their so-called natural spheres of interest. Therefore, regarding the trilateral meeting, it seems to me that, on the contrary, Putin will now take a pause. He is frightened, he is confused, he doesn't know how to react. The question of achieving any results in the upcoming negotiations, in whatever form they may take, will depend on the necessary pressure created by our allies. This pressure can be applied simultaneously by the US, Europe, and of course Ukraine. And we can see, in principle, how without unnecessary noise, Ukraine is conducting military operations on temporarily occupied territories, returning its lands to its control. Ukraine is carrying out targeted strikes on Russian infrastructure. All of this is excellent. All of this brings the logical end of this war closer. But it is obvious that as of today, the efforts made by our allies have not been sufficient. And let us hope that after the successful completion of the operation in Iran, there will be more motivation, opportunities, and resources to fulfill the promise made by Trump during the election campaign and finally put an end to Russian aggression against Ukraine.
thank you, Artyom.